strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. You're watching The Gist, and I'm Amitabh Revi. A warm welcome to all our viewers who are joining this stream live and watching from wherever you are at whatever time. And a welcome to all our viewers who will pick up the stream later on our YouTube channel. We joined again from Miami this time. Last time I think it was Montreal. Cleo Paskal, who's a senior non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, and an associate fellow at Chatham House. Cleo, sorry for waking up early in the morning, but thanks for coming.
Thank you. I don't think I can complain. It's 8:30, so we should all be at work now, right?
Well, you are, and so am I. Just looking at the things that have been happening over the last month, and you've been looking at it in depth in the Solomon Islands. Now, first of all, why should anybody care about what's happening in the faraway islands with what 650,000 people? But if you could explain that in terms of the CCP and China and the Pacific island chains.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for taking on the topic. I know it can seem like a remote location, but what's happening there is, well, first of all, it's a tragedy for the people of the Solomons, but it's also a very clear case study of what happens as China expands. So this area is really the front line now of Chinese political warfare expansion. And what happened in that country is very similar to watching what's happening in Hong Kong, for example. So you can see what a world where Chinese influence is paramount looks like. The Solomon Islands had diplomatic relations with Taiwan until 2019. And in 2019, the government that's still in power, led by Prime Minister Sogavare, unilaterally switched without any public consultation from Taiwan to China. And in the past 2 years, China and Chinese-linked companies have gone into the Solomons in a very overt and heavy-handed way in spite of the pandemic. They're taking over large sections of the economy. They tried to buy an entire island. You can see what it's like. And what it's like is pretty horrible. Politicians who oppose the switch or who want rights for their own people or want to protect their land rights or their economic resources are attacked through lawfare, through the three warfares, through psychological warfare, media warfare, and lawfare. One of them, who is quite a strong leader and popular leader of his people, ended up needing medical care, and the government tried to block him from leaving the country for medical care unless he bowed to the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan eventually gave him access to medical treatment that he needed on compassionate grounds, thanks to actually an intervention from Professor Malaita from India through his strong relationships with Taiwan, and the president of Taiwan wanted to give this treatment on compassionate grounds, and he went there for medical treatment. While he was away, they threatened to persecute him for treason. So it gives an idea of how not only does this economic expansion lead to political unrest, but it also leads to the exportation of things like the social credit system, where if you don't back the Chinese Communist Party, you can't get healthcare.
Wow. You've given us a little bit of background into what's happening in the Solomon Islands. As you pointed out, 2019, the Prime Minister Sogavare, who switched diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China. And now Malaita, I think that's the biggest island, right?
So it's the most populous. Yeah, it's where the most people live. Yeah.
And the Premier, Suidani, who's had this strident and persistent opposition. If you could explain that to us.
Yeah, so Malaita province, so the Solomon Islands only got independence from the UK in 1978. And there are a lot of different ethnic groups and language groups. And Malaita province, which is the most popular, is relatively untouched in terms of natural resource extraction. And it has had a complicated relationship with other parts of the country and has often felt left aside in terms of development. And the premier of that province, Daniel Suidani, is the one that I mentioned who needed medical care. And the reason that this medical care was blocked was because he has been one of the most vocal at saying that the switch from Taiwan to China was a result of bribery, that this has not been good for his people. They recently put out a press release, the Malaita government, explaining that since the switch to China, there have been incredible disparity in terms of economic development, but also things like their children have been raped by miners and loggers, really, really severe disruption. And it takes a lot of courage to speak openly about the problems with the Chinese Communist Party, which he does, but also against your own government. And so what happened was the central government, led by Sogavare with the backing of China, has been trying to get him kicked out of power. And one of the ways that they did that was using their influence and apparently large amounts of money to lodge a vote of no confidence against him last month. And the vote of no confidence created a huge outpouring of support for Suidani against the people lodging the vote of no confidence. And thousands came out into the streets to block entrance to the provincial parliament so that that vote of no confidence couldn't be lodged. And the police intervened and went to the person who was lodging the vote of no confidence, that grouping, and said, you really have to reconsider this because we can't protect you. That this is so against the will of the people that this is going to be a problem. So they withdrew the vote of no confidence. And then there have been reconciliation meetings, and the province has been trying to knit itself together. Based on that, last week, there was the national parliament opened, and demonstrators from across the Solomons, but largely from Malaita province, went to the capital, which is about a 3.5-hour boat ride away, and were peacefully demonstrating to say, we don't want CCP interference, we don't want the corruption, we want this prime minister to step down. The police fired tear gas into the demonstrators, and chaos ensued, and there was rioting and looting and a lot of opportunistic taking advantage of the situation. And it was starting to calm down, and politicians who were supporting, members of parliament who were supporting Sogavare, the prime minister, started to think about maybe withdrawing their support and forming a new government without Sogavare. And the police, again, had gone to Sogavare, like they had done in Malaita province, and said, maybe you should consider stepping aside. The people really aren't happy with your policies and what you're doing. And at that point, he asked the Australians to come in to protect basically his government. But what it looks like is the Australians going in to protect a corrupt CCP-backed prime minister. And so that was kind of sent shockwaves through the region. And the Australians have arrived with police and troops and are currently in the capital, Oceania, of the Solomon Islands.
Right. If I can flesh out that last point of yours, Australia, if you look at it from outside, you'd probably think it's a good thing that the Australians are there in terms of trying to calm things down. But you pointed out in your writings of late of how it seems, well, there's a history to it also. And it also seems like Australia is doing the heavy lifting for China while China sits back. Yeah.
And also, the Solomon Islanders are fully capable of sorting out their own problems. It would be like saying, when there are farmer protests in India, the British should send troops to calm things down. Like it's a lack of trust. Yes, there was a civil war, but since the civil in the Solomons, and there was an Australian deployment at that time, but there are mechanisms in place, like the Townsville Peace Agreement, which was signed in 21 years ago by the man who's the current prime minister, that can be followed. Also, there are ways of getting involved. that aren't necessarily military. So, for example, the Fijians are welcome because the Fijians are seen as being very good at dialogue type situations. But this intervention makes it look, and this is how it feels, especially to people in Malaita, that they were on the verge of having a political shift, and the Australians came in to protect this very unpopular prime minister. And there are, questions about, whether this was linked to Australian businesses getting concessions, and so wanting to protect Sogavare going forward, and whether it's true or not. Those perceptions alone are extremely corrosive. And you often hear, well, if the Australians didn't go in, then the Chinese would have gone in, and that would have been worse. And there are two problems to that. One is if the Chinese had gone in, first of all, it would have been clear to everybody what the situation was, and Sogavare would have not had international support, and it would have been a dicey move for the Chinese, because the guy is clearly so corrupt and unpopular. But second, again, the locals can sort it out themselves if they're given the space to do it. It's their country, and they don't necessarily need an intervention every time they have a problem. Nobody was deliberately killed by rioters that we know. Chinatown was burnt down, but it hasn't gone to other parts of the city, let alone other parts of the country.
Some comments from our viewers. Matara, Cleo says, thanks for getting Cleo back. We do that almost every day, but she's flying out, I think, today to the UK. And Omkar says he's read your article and admired the way the topic was dealt with. Gives very good insight to the topic. Now, talking about insight, when you're talking about these two, the Prime Minister and the Premier of Malaita and China and Taiwan supporting factions there, there is another insight that you point out. It's not just the traditional support or opposition to China. There is religion and roots that are involved there, right?
Yeah, and that's something that's often left out of the Western-based discussion about China. When the switch happened in 2019, the government of Daniel Suidani put out the Auki communique, which said, among other things, that they wanted a moratorium on CCP-linked companies operating in their province. And one of the reasons that they gave was that they believe in freedom of religion, and they themselves are very devout. They're Christians. And they view the Chinese Communist Party as systemically atheist, which it is. I mean, communism is deeply against religion because it's a competing operating system for humanity, which is why the Chinese Communist Party goes after the Uyghurs and goes after the Tibetans. Because if you believe in something larger than yourself at that kind of faith-based level, it actually gives you a lot of internal strength, and you're less likely to be willing to comply to Communist Party dictates. So this is actually, it's for the Solomon Islanders who have this position, this is almost a religious war, or a war against religion. And dealing with the Chinese Communist Party is dealing with people who are persecuting people of faith, all faiths, including Christians. So for them, this is a very deep issue, which is why when Daniel Suidani was sick and he needed medical care, and his options were take money from the Chinese Communist Party or die because he thought he had a potentially life-threatening illness, he didn't take the money, because for him, his journey after death was as important as his journey when he was alive, and the two are interlinked. So that kind of inner strength is so fundamentally important for understanding what scares the Chinese Communist Party, and what gives you strength when you're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party.
There are a couple of questions that are not related to the topic, but since somebody's paying 100 rupees, I'm just going to put them up there. Hi, Cleo. Why are BlackRock still invested in PRC? Why is JP backtracking his joke? Also, the probability of Pentagon arming the Baloch. Thank you. And I think someone has another one, which is about should India initiate a resolution for Tibet? I think topics for another time. But
Well,
since you were talking about,
I'll take the BlackRock one because
okay,
yeah, because because it's a good one. I mean, I think you know the answer, but you know, as a Canadian, you know. You know, the Canadian ambassador to China is a former major investment money guy, and he's married to a woman from BlackRock who still works for BlackRock. So these are very overt ties. You don't have to look far to see these ties. And that's why it's not surprising that if you see a situation like the one that you're seeing in the Solomons, your first instinct might be to say, where's the money in here? Because the Solomons, it is small, but it is highly strategically located, and it has a lot of resources, including some of the elements, metals needed for the new economy. So it is a very good question. In terms of what India should do in Tibet, that's certainly a question for India and not me, but I would definitely recommend being prepared, because China will not be backing down in the Himalayas. They'll just be repositioning and strengthening until they feel they're ready enough to strike. But Chinese strategists know that, and in fact, Amitabh, you know that much better than I do.
when you were talking about Chinese strategy, and there's another question from Gokul Jayaraman, how do you defend against Chinese cyber warfare? And you've been writing, I think, much before any of this unrest happened in Solomons about with documents saying that, you know, the faction led by the Prime Minister and a certain number 39, which allows for the constitution to be changed, has been bought off by China.
Yeah, so there was so that in this particular case, and this shows how overt the corruption has become, and why it's kind of indefensible to protect this guy. Even when the country was working with Taiwan, what Taiwan would do was give money to their 50 members of parliament in the Solomons, and each member of parliament would get a chunk of money as a constituency fund. There's basically kind of direct support to these members of parliament, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why, you know, I'm a huge supporter of Taiwan. I mean, you don't even have to be a supporter of Taiwan. It exists. It is a country, you know, that's kind of factual. But some of their foreign policy, I think, has been a little bit lacking. And the idea that you can kind of outbribe China, or, you know, is not working. You can't outbribe China. They've got more money, and they've got a whole other box of tools that they're willing to use that you're not. And so the engagement has to be much more just kind of, as you saw with Suidani. Suidani supports Taiwan not because of money. He doesn't get any money. It's if he had money, he would have been able to afford the medical treatment. It's because of his own personal priorities and his faith in things like faith, but also democracy and human rights. He truly believes it. And so building on that and not creating kind of an environment where your relationships are based on money is probably a better way forward for Taiwan. Right is on their side. Morality is on their side. It's a tougher fight, but it's much more durable. Anyway, so they had given money to each of the 50 members of parliament. And what happened recently was Sogavare gave Chinese money from a Chinese bank account directly to the 39 members of parliament that supported him only and didn't give money to the other 11. That's how overt it is. You support me, here's some Chinese money. And it's all out in the public, and you talk about how to wage the psychological warfare. And a big part of it is coverage, media coverage, honest, open media coverage, so people know what they're dealing with. We had a kind of a question from somebody in the US. We were doing some sort of seminar, and the question was, how do you stop students, scientists, from being poached from Harvard or Yale or whatever to go set up scientific laboratories in China. This thing. And, if it becomes clear that this is the equivalent of going and setting up a lab in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or a lab in Nazi Germany during the 30s, and you might be getting the money, but none of your friends think you're a good person afterwards, then that gives you some pushback on that psychological warfare.
Another question for you, Cleo, from M. Masand. You alluded to it earlier. Bonjour. Are the Australians looking to curry favor with the locals, thereby leading to a malleable government similar to Papua New Guinea?
Well, bonjour. That's a good question. I think if they want to curry favor with the locals, this isn't the way to do it. The PNG question is a very good question, though, so I'll get to that after. But there have been huge, apart from everything else, the economies of the Pacific have been very affected by travel bans as a result of COVID. And even as travel is opening up, there have been quarantines in place. So when Premier Suidani came back from Taiwan and landed in this, first he had to quarantine in Australia, and then he had to quarantine in the Solomons for like 3 weeks or something. The Australian troops are walking off their planes into the streets of the Solomons. Solomons doesn't have any COVID, and so it is not popular. It is not currying favor. The images, by the way, of Chinatown. Another thing to mention is that, again, across the Pacific, in a lot of places, the economic center is a Chinatown or a location run by Chinese, retail location run by Chinese, because of the way they've taken over the recently arrived ethnic Chinese have taken over the retail sectors across the region. So, it is just sort of one of the main commercial areas. In terms of PNG, so there are PNG troops that have also arrived with the Australians. They have kind of cultural ethnic links with Sogavare. So there is a lot of concern in the country that these troops, these PNG troops, are less disciplined and more likely to follow Sogavare's lead than the Australians are, for example. So there is some fear around those particular troops in the country. So that PNG Solomons relationship is very complicated. Sogavare spent a lot of time in PNG. I think he was born there, actually. So it's a very good question. These are artificial boundaries to countries that are cutting through ethnic groups. We know this very well from India's neighborhood area, how that can create complications in the region.
You've again been pointing out for a long time how the people, not all just of Solomons, but the whole area in Oceania, and you've done it in depth, should be given options, whether it's the US, whether it's Australia, India, the Quad.
Yeah, I think there are two different roles for India potentially to play if it wants to. One is India is one of the only countries, and we know this from many different sectors, that can help to displace the Chinese economic engagement. So China's economic engagement comes in because it's relatively low cost. So it can outcompete the Western economies. India's goods and services are also low cost, but they're much better quality, much more reliable, and they link into a country that is pluralistic, democratic, English speaking, it has all of those other advantages as well. So a lot of countries in the Pacific have, that I've spoken with, the leadership has consistently said, we want more India. We want, Indian pharmaceuticals. We want, Indian campuses. We want Indian tech. We want Indians to help us develop our apps for, for even rideshare app, whatever it is. So they really want more engagement with India. They feel culturally compatible. Again, because the things that are important to most Indians, faith, family, and freedom to do what you want in comparison to a place like the Chinese Communist Party-run countries, is very important to them. So one is kind of that bilateral relationship at an economic, social, cultural level. And the other is via the Quad to create a situation of external security against things like illegal fisheries, to be available for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also to push back some of that Chinese strategic encroachment. And I think that particularly in that respect, there's a lot to be explored. A priority region, which we can talk about if you want now or some other time, would be Micronesia, which are the islands a little bit to the north. But for example, if in this particular case in the Solomons, India, as I mentioned, I don't think that the country needs external engagement. And if there is external engagement like there is now with Australia, it should be geared towards creating an environment where the Solomon Islanders don't feel like the Australians have picked a side, but have created a space for them to continue with their own political process, which is the stated goal of the Australians, but that's not how it is appearing at the moment. But this is a place where if India came in, I don't suggest it does, but India would do that sort of an engagement. However, perhaps through Fiji, it could have some backup. Fiji could have some backup institutionally to help create some of those reconciliation engagements that are desperately needed in the region.
That's if you get involved politically, you're talking about economics and business, where Indians could possibly be looked upon more favorably. But how do you assess the Indian? I mean, the acronyms. I have to look them up again. What is it? The India Forum for the Indo-Pacific Island Cooperation. That's FIPIC, and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. How do you assess those?
So the fact that you don't know the acronyms, I think, is probably a good indication.
No, any acronym.
No, well,
even when AUKUS came out.
Yeah. So Prime Minister Modi at the beginning in 2016 went to Fiji and met with the leaders and was very welcome. And there was some statements made about the engagement, and then it kind of petered out. And it's understandable. It's not like India doesn't have enough on its plate, and the MEA is very overstretched as it is. So it has been a bit of an institutional priority. The Pacific Islands have come in structurally into the MEA, but I would actually think something more like a chamber of commerce that is designed to deal with smaller economies would be more effective, because yes, there needs to be some governmental kind of oversight, but the engagement they actually need isn't necessarily aid. It just other economic, educational, healthcare, IT options, and India's businesses may view them as too small to engage with. But there are a lot of small-scale businesses in India, village-scale economics, that do very well economically and that are the right kind of structure for those economies, but they're not meeting each other. So some sort of chamber of commerce for businesses that are capable and interested in dealing with the region. There are lots of contracts in the region. One of the problems with Malaita is there's an infrastructure contract through the World Bank that's worth about $5 million that the central government has been trying to push through a Chinese company. No Indian companies have bid for it. So 5 million, might not be much to a big Indian company, but to a smaller, medium-sized Indian infrastructure company, that makes sense for them. And so creating those linkages is really what they need, the sort of help that they need.
124 Madness requests me to put this question for you. Has the West been unfair and dishonest, given the past history when East Timor and Australia clashed over oil in the South Pacific? Has China exploited this very well?
Yeah, so, I mean, there are not a lot of countries with halos floating over them. Countries tend to look after their own interests, and the Australians and the New Zealanders certainly have been pursuing their own economic interests in the region. And a lot of these are former colonies of Australia and New Zealand, as with the Solomons, for example. And in the Solomons, just a couple weeks ago, they had a major, very emotional reconciliation ceremony for an event that happened in 1927, when the British imposed a head tax, and the Solomon Islanders didn't have the money to pay for it, obviously. So they were given the opportunity to work on the British plantations to earn the money to pay their head tax. So this was not popular for some reason or another. And when one of the Australian tax collectors, district officers, came to a region in Malaita, he and a lot of his party were killed. And then the British mounted a punitive expedition, which included the relatives of some of the local police officers who had been killed, and killed a lot more people, and raped people, and burnt villages, and desecrated family shrines, which was very emotionally destructive to the people in the region. And just a couple of weeks ago, in Malaita, they held a reconciliation ceremony to bring together the surviving cultural elements to reconcile, which they did. And the central government didn't get involved. The Australians didn't. The British didn't, obviously. And so what Malaita showed was they can solve these deep, lingering problems, and the central government is not interested in it. So the role of Western countries in the region is the role that you'd expect from any colonial power, especially at that time in history. It lingered longer than in a lot of places. As mentioned, the Solomons only got independence in 78. And that's absolutely accurate. But what the Chinese are doing, you can't say just because the West was bad, it's okay for the Chinese to be bad. You know, the West was bad, nobody should be bad. And what the Chinese are doing now is incredibly socially, economically destructive again, and it needs to stop.
A quick answer for Derek Shaw's question, Cleo. What do you think the Australian government stands to gain with this action? Is it purely to deter direct Chinese intervention, or is it part of a greater strategy to deny China? You've answered this in parts earlier.
Yeah, well, and just to be clear, because that is one of the justifications that they're giving. If that is the goal, that is certainly not what's being accomplished, because it's keeping in place a pro-PRC government, and it's alienating Australia from the Malaitans now feel that not just China is against them, but Australia is against them. So if that's the goal, that's not being accomplished. The stated goal is to create a situation of peace, which kind of there already is already, in order to continue with the political process. But I'm not sure that is being accomplished either. As for the deeper goals, that's above my pay grade.
I don't think it is. But anyway, Cleo, Paskal, there are lots of comments and questions still coming in, and they're taking us all across the globe. We'll leave that for another time, especially the one detailed one on Micronesia that you were talking about and you have written a lot about. Thanks again for your time early in the morning, and safe flight to the UK.
Thank you. Great to see you. And thanks for your great coverage. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Cleo. And thank you to all our viewers who have participated in this and who will see this show later. If you do know about us already and are subscribing to our YouTube channel, do help spread the word. If you are watching this for the first time, do check out the mosaic of other work we have both on our website and YouTube channel. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.